germinated from. During my senior year of high school, my AP English teacher had us write a research paper about an author and his novel. And the goal of this was kind of to explain the idea that there's no such thing as literature there's no such thing as fiction within literature, because all of fiction is representative of past experiences that the author has seen. And it's really just almost a recollection of these events, and it kind of hit along those ideas. And so we were supposed to really research the influences on certain writings and people, and then show it in the novels. And so I decided to do J.R.R Tolkien, my essay called Honoring God, the Lord of the Rings. Why I chose to research J.R.R Tolkien, the Lord of the Rings, first of all, like everybody else in here, I think I really became fascinated with the Lord of the Rings through the Peter Jackson movies. And by not reading the books in 5th grade. Loved the storyline, loved the characters, and as a 5th grade boy, I especially loved the action. And so I decided to read the books in 5th grade, and this wasn't something that I really should have done as a 5th grader, because a lot of it was way over my head, especially the important parts of the mythology. Didn't really have a good comprehension of the novel at the end of reading those things. And so my senior year of high school, I said, okay, well, now I'll read these books and talk about it in this presentation. Why I chose to research Christianity's influence in the Lord of the Rings. Originally, my outline, the thesis for my outline was a list of things, because Tolkien has a ton of influences on his writing. There's a ton of literature about Tolkien and the influences that he had. So, there's a lot of stuff that people have resurfaced and talked about. He fought in World War I, and the trench warfare is really similar to Mordor. Or you can see the monster Grendel from Beowulf being a really important factor in the Lord of the Rings. And there's tons of little stuff in studying linguistics and religion, of course. I had a conversation with my professor, whose name we call Ike. And I decided to look at solely how religion shaped Tolkien's mythology, because he's like, hey, you can't do this. A thesis is not a list. You need to do something that's really clear and talk about it throughout the novel or throughout the work. So I started looking through a few drafts. By the second draft of my first paper, I kind of realized I can't really talk about the dude's faith, because it's really hard. Faith is such a personal thing. It's really difficult to try to verbalize something in the way that God kind of works in your heart, especially if you don't know the person. I never met Tolkien in my life, sad to say, and so I felt like I'd be really doing him a disservice if I chose to try to talk about his faith and try to just use whatever words I could think of off the top of my head. So I decided to just look at the evidence of it in the Lord of the Rings, and knowing his Catholic background, I was able to determine that there's a lot of interesting literary analysis that can be done to see some allegorical characterizations of people in the Lord of the Rings. So what I intended to prove, my thesis statement was, although Tolkien's intention when writing the Lord of the Rings was to write a fantasy novel, inadvertently he created a religious allegorical work of fiction. And these 4 remaining points are things that I'm going to present to you in the presentation one by one. First of all, let's talk about the first one, which is Lord of the Rings is a fairy story whose author inadvertently exposes personal theology within the characters. This first quote that I have is what really shaped how my paper was going to go along. It said, The Lord of the Rings is, of course, a fundamentally religious and Catholic novel, unconsciously so at first, but consciously in the revision. Richard Purtill quotes one of Tolkien's letters. This is a word from Tolkien himself. He called the works a religious and Catholic novel, unconsciously so at first, which basically means he wrote down his idea for a fairy story, and afterwards he looked it over and said, oh my gosh, there's tons of stuff that relates to Christ, and so he kind of made it a little bit more intentional throughout the novel. The second quote is another thing from Tolkien. He said that the Arthurian legend fails as a fairy story, partly because it is involved in and explicitly contains the Christian religion. Tolkien was not a big fan of the Arthurian legends because of that reason. It was so explicitly contains the Christian religion, and also there's a lot of documented sources about how Tolkien really disliked his friend C.S. Lewis's writing, especially the allegorical, very clear allegory of Aslan as God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit throughout the whole, what is the series that Lewis wrote? It's really clear in that. What's that?
You said that he disliked it?
Yeah, but he wasn't a fan of it. It was so clear and so obvious. He might have been a fan of it as a thing, but he was really intentionally trying to write a fairy story. And so he felt like his friend Lewis's writing failed as a fairy story because of the fact that it is so explicitly containing the Christian religion along with these Arthurian legends. The second point I want to prove, this is the quote that I think really kind of shaped everything. It's my favorite quote in the paper that I wrote. It says, the Christianity in the Lord of the Rings is found in the moral mythos of the characters. There is no mention of God, no one is worshipped, there are no prayers, and there are indications of great deeds of virtue. Yet implicit in the context between good and evil is a limited, I can't pronounce this word right, I know what it means, can't pronounce it. For the third age of Middle Earth. Eschatology, thank you. Appreciate that. For the third age of Middle Earth. This is the exact quote that I want to bring a lot of attention to. A theology contains the narrative rather than being contained by it. So it's a part of Tolkien's theology rather than, there being such a clear mention of God, worshiping of God, prayers to God in the novel itself. The third point, in the Lord of the Rings, good and evil and the free will to choose either is reflected in contrast to similar characters. So first, Tolkien considered the work, the novel a Catholic work, as I talked about in that quote earlier, as his faith and experience are a basis for the moral conflicts of Middle Earth. And so I'm going to read this quote right here, and just there's a lot of 9 really is very clear in pointing out this is God and Satan. But just look for just some of the characteristics. He said that in the beginning there was one God, Eru, the one who runs an Aurdur, is called the Iluvatar, and he made first the Aurdur, the holy ones, who were the offspring of the Sot, and they were with him before aught else was made. And Melkor was originally ranked the highest of the Aurdur, and he presides over the element of fire. His persistent pursuit of his own idiosyncratic themes give him a role that constantly acts against the constructive efforts of the other Aurdur. These two figures, Eru, Iluvatar, and Melkor, are in the Silmarillion, and for you guys who've read the Silmarillion, you guys are really aware of this. They're the two contrasting figures, and you can obviously see the quote starts off with the words "in the beginning." It's very clear. Okay, this is a God character. He made the Aurdur. He's the creator of all things. That people are the offspring of his thought. And Melkor is originally ranked the highest of the Aurdur and resides over the element of fire. Obviously, this is a Satan figure. You can see where Tolkien's thought was going with these things. He also said I said in my paper, the conflict between these two figures interrupt the world that Eru, the creator of Middle Earth, he created. And Knight said, thus the earth and its how do you pronounce this right? Primeval, appreciate it. You guys are helping me out so much today. Primeval history goes through many tumults, of a volcanic nature. I'll explain this in the next slide. These tumults or instances of disorder are ingrained into the individuals whom Tolkien uses as juxtaposition of moral virtue. And I said that Tolkien's able to show how the battle of good and evil is not really just a battle between these two God and Satan characters, but it's a much more personal battle, as you can see in the scene Frodo's society. And, he has the free will to drop the ring in the fires of Mount Doom, or just to hold on to it, and to hold on to it, I guess. And this basically says the idea is that Tolkien's work suggests is that there's destiny with choice. And this quote about the two ring bearers kind of brings that statement to light. It says that Bilbo was meant to find the ring, but whether he is strong enough to pass it on to Frodo is genuinely endowed as Frodo's destiny to be the ring bearer. But he may shirk that destiny either by refusing at the beginning or by failing to carry out this mission. Both ring bearers have the opportunity to hold on to the ring, keep it for themselves, or to pass it on to another person, or in Frodo's case, the Lake of Fire, so that they can eliminate all evil in the world. I said the free will to choose a side in this moral war is manifested in characters who show striking similarities but differ on the choice between good and evil. And these four are an example of that. There's tons of characters in the Lord of the Rings that really manifest this. But these are just four I want to talk about. Petty talks about Gandalf and Saruman. He says that both Gandalf and Saruman are of the same species, sorcerers of great power, yet of opposing motivations. Thus, Gandalf's benevolence enables him to conquer his nemesis Moria, where Saruman's lust for reign and personal power becomes his doom. Petty does a really good job of pointing out that these two, as she said, are from the same species. And they're both they have the same purpose in life, to be able to help the forces of the Aurdur and the men and the elves and the dwarves to combat the forces of evil in Middle-earth. But it's just that simple choice to, when he says benevolence enables him to conquer his nemesis in Moria, it's Gandalf's choice to give his life for his friends that really helps him be able to finish out what he's planned to do. And Saruman's choice to obsess over the ring and side with Sauron in the hope that he gets a ring is his doom. It's eventually what happens to him, and that you can see at the end of the novels. If you know anything about the Lord of the Rings, you can see the two obviously have different consequences of their actions, and you'd much rather take Gandalf's side if you have a choice. Let's talk about Boromir and Faramir. Penny talks about Boromir and Faramir on page 80. She says that Faramir has the capacity for sympathy to listen to Frodo's intention to destroy the ring and the strength to reject it. Boromir succumbs to the influence of the ring. What makes these two people more fascinating than Gandalf and Saruman is not only they're the same species, they have the same goal to protect Gondor, but they also have the exact same parents. They're brothers, and I think it's really well manifested, the idea of free will between the two of them, because obviously both of them have the opportunity to take the ring from Frodo, but Boromir, when he tries to do it, ends up dying at Emon Hand. Although gloriously, he still dies, and Faramir ends up at the end of the Return of the King, married to Éowyn, and have a fantastic life, and he has some type of political role in Gondor, which I'm not really 100% sure of. I can't remember. It's been a long time since I read the books, and again, I didn't understand it as a fifth grader. Denethor and Theoden, these two are also really good because they're kings of men. Penny said that Theoden and Denethor, the evil of Sauron works upon both, yet Theoden, with the aid of Gandalf, throws out the spell and rises to a glorious death while Denethor is crushed, attempting to burn his remaining son alive in the fire that becomes his own. Denethor chooses to become insane and try to kill the only heir to the throne, or the only heir to the steward. I don't even know how to pronounce this correctly, but into his line necessarily to kill himself. And then Theoden, dies gloriously in battle at the Battle of Minas Tirith and becomes he's buried amongst his fathers, and he's well regarded in Rohirrim legend. And finally, Gollum and Smeagol. This is by far my favorite character of the series. Not only because I can do a really good Smeagol impression, but also because he's just a character that's so twisted. I'll read the quote. When Frodo finally meets Gollum face to face, he uses the power of the ring to establish an ascendancy over him, but also treats him with kindness, so that Gollum is torn between a growing love for Frodo and his ravenous desire for the ring. And you guys, everybody, I think most of them here have seen The Two Towers. That one scene where where Sam and Frodo are sleeping, and the two of them are talking to each other, and Smeagol says, "Leave now and never come back." It's a really fascinating scene because you can really see the free will in the two of them. You can see the fact that Gollum is really desiring for the ring. It's such a fascinating concept because Gollum is the character that's physically, spiritually, socially, mentally, physically dependent upon the ring in every category. And Smeagol's actually experiencing love for the first time since he bought the ring. And so, or not bought, he stole it from his brother, killed his brother in the action as well. It's a really fascinating concept to see these two things manifest in Smeagol and Gollum. That's probably my favorite character of Lord of the Rings. And finally, many of Tolkien's characters have distinct characteristics of the central figures in Christianity. Let's talk about Gandalf first of all. Percival talks about Gandalf, and he says that an angelic being embodied in human form is sent to help in the battle of good and evil. Gandalf, who gives up his life and spreads the bridge of Khazad-dûm, is a free creature who freely answers the call to imitate Christ. A lot of people, when they see The Lord of the Rings for the first time and being well aware of C.S. Lewis's novel, say, this is Gandalf's Jesus because of this. And that's not the case. Gandalf makes a lot of errors in his planning, which is something that Jesus would never do. Angelic deity being, or at least the Christian religion holds. Gandalf instead is somebody that imitates Christ through his action. It's really, and I think we can all picture the scene of "You shall not pass," falling into the ravine of Khazad-dûm and really emulating Christ because he's able to save everybody by fighting a Balrog. And he also says that, and Isaac says that the wizard undergoes a harrowing prefiguring of the death, descended to hell, and rising again from the dead. I don't think there's an image where in Lord of the Rings that's more angelic than when Gandalf has come back from the dead in the second movie, and he's withdrawing, basically the demon of Saruman from Theoden, and Theoden says, "You have no power here, Gandalf the Grey," and Gandalf throws off his cloak to reveal the whiteness within. And if you're watching that, you're like, "Oh my gosh, okay, this is obviously a Christ embodiment." Especially since he's drawing the demon from Saruman. It's just a fascinating concept, and so Gandalf has a distinct characteristics of Jesus and Christianity. Frodo, this is a character that I think probably has a lot, or at least Perkill suggests that there's pretty much everything Frodo does, especially on the last trip to Mordor. He's emulating Christ in a lot of things. He parallels the two of them. He says that Frodo's physical suffering parallels those of Christ. He's in prison, he's stripped of his garments, mocked and whipped. He also says that Frodo is terribly weary, and the ring becomes a more and more intolerable burden. Frodo's journey now powerfully recalls Christ carrying of the cross, which makes a lot of sense. The ring is a burden, the cross is a burden. Tolkien's called Frodo actions the salvation of the world. I think that's very clear at the Christ embodiment as well. And finally, he says, and finally, Tolkien says, he, Gandalf, and Frodo, who walks his own way of the cross, are thus closest to Tolkien's deepest moral ideas. And finally, let's talk about Aragorn, or Eleazar, who I'm specifically talking about. Cotcher says Gandalf invokes religion as he crowns the kneeling Aragorn. Now come the days of the king, and may they be blessed while the thrones of valor endure. Very rapture-orientated. You kind of see the fact that now come the days of the king. The return of the king, the title itself is somewhat suggestive in that. And finally, this was part of my conclusion paragraph. It said, "The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien was able to acknowledge his values as a moral system for Middle-earth. As a result, Tolkien's personal theology gave an otherwise entertaining fairy story spiritual significance." This is my works cited. Anyone have any questions?
My favorite character is Samwise. Do you know anything about Samwise?
Yeah, in my original draft, I was very, Christ-orientated. I didn't really take the first quotes that I talked about at the beginning. The Lord of the Rings is a Christian novel or Catholic novel, unconsciously so at first, but consciously in the revision. I kind of didn't read that quote right and just said, oh, this is saying that the Lord of the Rings is a Christian work, and so I just started talking extensively about how this is like an allegorical characterization of things, and that's not necessarily the case. And so Samwise is somebody that Purtill's book, which by the way we have at the UCLA Library, J.R.R Tolkien, Its Morality and Religion. He talks really extensively about all the hobbits, Bilbo, Frodo, and Samwise the Brave, of course. Sam is very characteristic of Jesus. In fact, even that picture that I have there, I don't know if it's going to go back, it doesn't matter, you guys remember it, it's when Sam is holding, he's holding Frodo at Mordor. It's very, oh, what's that work? Yeah, you guys know what I'm talking about. That picture of that statue when Mary's holding Jesus, It's like, I watched that, and Raquel and I were doing this last night, and I was like, man, this is totally it. It's a fascinating concept. But anyway, Sam is characteristic of Mary in that picture. Obviously, his benevolence for Frodo is extremely Christ-like. He's got a lot of feminine qualities because he's so intent on being around Frodo. He's very jealous of Frodo because of, Smeagol's presence, who technically is a bad character, although I like to think is a good character. Anyway, I'm rambling, and I'm partially answering your question, but I'm just talking most of the time. So, on to the next person.
Can we hear your Smeagol?
Oh, man.
It's a little bit embarrassing. No, it's not. I really love doing it.
Truth.
Man, I want to quote the movie right, so I'm going to try to do that scene, but I can't. I'll try to do it for him. I'll just basically, he goes, my precious will answer to the world that you got your precious!
How many times have you read Lord of the Rings?
Once. I've seen the movies, and Kate had a quote earlier in the week when I was hanging out with him. He said he's seen Inception a million times with subtitles on, dissecting it. I've done that many times with the Lord of the Rings. I mean, it's to a point. I think everybody in this room can say we've seen this movie enough that we can quote it a million times. So, I honestly, to tell you the truth, I haven't read it that much. So I couldn't even call myself a Tolkien scholar. I've just read the works of everybody else, and I haven't read all of it. And I found that to be fascinating. I read that in 5th grade. I thought that was a really fascinating work. It was written for kids, I guess. So it kind of registered with me. But answer your question just once. I need to read it again. Anybody else? Always surely more.
Well, just a comment, I guess, is if you think that this is loaded with religious subtext, read the Silmarillion. It's the entire prehistory of Middle-earth, like 5,000 years before the Lord of the Rings, and there's even more in there.
How many times have you read the Silmarillion?
Just one.
Oh, that's right. You read it once. That's.
Not every Lord of the Rings books, at least.
I see that as a higher authority. Who's next? All right. I'm open for questions. questions more if you guys have it. I'm sure that you guys have studied these and found some characteristics that are good more. Love talking about this, obviously. I've given a 20-minute presentation, so it's 16 minutes. So thank you guys, I appreciate it, and enjoy yourselves.